Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for attending this session. It's a bit of a mouthful of a title, but hopefully over the next few slides you'll get a better idea of what I'm actually going to talk about, and hopefully this will be interesting for you. So it's a pleasure to be back here after 12 years. It sounds like a very long time, and I've been racking my brains to figure out what I've been doing for those 12 years and where I've been and who I've seen and everything else. But yeah, it's been 12 years. And just to set the record straight, Virus Bulletin hasn't been rejecting me for like 12 years since I presented in Vienna, 2007, but I've just not been able to attend for various reasons. So it's great to be back, great to see the VB conference still going strong, and also that there's now some cyber threat intelligence programs coming in as well the last few years, which has been great, and there's been some great talks the last couple of days. So thanks for having me and allowing me to contribute to speak today. I believe this is also the first time Unit 42 and Palo Alto Networks has spoken here, and hopefully this won't be the last. And yeah, just to crack on, so my name is Alex Hinchliffe. I'm a threat intelligence analyst at Unit 42, which is part of Palo Alto Networks. Prior to that, I was at Intel and McAfee in the US and McAfee Labs in the UK, doing a mixture of Windows malware research and Android malware research as well. And given it's the last day of the conference, we've just had lunch, I thought I'd kick us off with a bit of humor, just get us in the right mood, especially as many of you might not know who Palo Alto Networks is. And if I can get my clicker to work, that would be great. There we go. We're also learning a lot about Google Slides here and how it operates with this technology. So I found this on Twitter, a bit of fun, but it might give you an idea of who Palo Alto Networks is. I'll let you read it for a minute because time is precious, and then we'll move on. So apparently, all the cool kids have Palo Alto Networks. I don't know about that, but this guy clearly loves defense in depth with his firewalls. So if you get through to the internal network, you're doing a pretty good job. I don't know where it came from on Twitter, but I'm sure you can find it. So the other thing is, I get asked a lot, where does the name Unit 42 come from? If you've ever read the book or watched the movie, Douglas Adams' Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the meaning of life, the universe, and everything is 42. So we shamelessly stole it, and we used that as part of our name. But I think mainly it was because our executive staff were just getting fed up of saying Palo Alto Networks Threat Intelligence Team every time in a sentence they wanted to talk about us. So there you go. Okay, so the agenda today, I'm going to talk about PKPLUG, which is the moniker or the name we've given to a set of activity we've been tracking for a few years. And I'll go over, the history of it, a bit of an overview. I'm going to dive into one piece of malware in particular that we discovered a while back called HenBox, which is Android related. I'm also going to talk about some more recent activities. So this is stuff that we've been watching for now, well, initially 3 years. It's expanded to about 6 years worth of activity. But there's stuff that's happened in the last few months. So I'm going to share some of that with you as well. And then finally, time permitting, I'm going to talk a bit about Adversary Playbooks and how we're sharing some of our threat intel, not just the indicators of compromise, but also the TTPs, the behaviors of these adversaries as well. And you may have heard about some of that stuff in the last day or so. So the overview of PKPLUG is that it's espionage motivated, so they've got lots of tools around backdoors, remote shells, spyware for Android, and various other things that they use to get a foothold into a network, track people, spy on people, steal information, the usual kind of espionage stuff. At the moment we say group or groups. We don't have enough visibility to know exactly if it's one group or multiple groups using the same tools with different tasking. From experience of looking at some Chinese groups in the past, it can be very convoluted, confusing, pretty complex to try and figure out exactly where the delineation is between the different groups. So right now that's where we are. We've been tracking them for about 3 years, and that will become more clear as we look at the next couple of slides. But they've been active, at least as far as we can tell, for a good 6 years or more. Using a combination of publicly available malware, so things like Poison Ivy and PlugX, which do the rounds, especially with Chinese adversaries. But we've also seen 9002 be used, the HenBox and Farseer stuff that we discovered. We've never seen before. We've never seen any other groups using it, so it's custom built. In terms of targeting, there's been a lot of talk over the last few days about, I'm just going to check the slide actually worked, about the kind of Southeast Asia and Central Asia region and how that's a bit of a hotbed at the moment. So the targeting that we see with higher confidence are things like Outer Mongolia or the independent Mongolia, the Xinjiang region of China, the northwest region of China, which is an autonomous region. Near there, we've got Tibet as well, which is a lower confidence for us, just in terms of visibility of what we're seeing. Myanmar and Taiwan are high confidence, and then Vietnam and Indonesia are lower confidence at the moment. So if we look at the history and information there, countries like Taiwan and Mongolia have a long-standing history of economics, but also kind of independence and violence between each other. So there's a lot of interesting ties there. With Taiwan, we see things like the cross-strait relations being tested. And if you've seen the news recently, the US, or rather Taiwan, have bought about $2 billion worth of military equipment from the US, which should be delivered in the next year or two. China's pretty unhappy about this. We see lots of information in the news about the South China Sea and disputes there. So there are numerous countries that are claiming ownership over various parts of that part of the sea. Things like fishing rights are up for grabs, but also there's yet unproven oil and gas reserves there, so it's quite a heated topic. And you often get foreign militaries coming through that area as well, just to try and keep the peace, and that probably doesn't help. So most, if not all, of these countries and regions that I'm talking about today are part of the BRI, or the Belt Road Initiative. I'm not going to go into any detail about this, but I believe there was a talk yesterday from Deloitte. I missed it because I was on a panel, but I think the talk was largely about the BRI and how the targeting of some of these Chinese adversaries maps to some of that activity. But certainly, the countries I've talked about and the regions like Xinjiang and Mongolia are critical parts of the BRI for China, so it kind of makes sense that they are targeted. And we've also got 3 of those countries that I've mentioned are part of the Asian Association, which is a group of about, I think, 10 countries at the moment in Asia that do intergovernmental communication, sharing and other stuff. So again, a viable target for China, given they're not members. So in terms of the history, one of the first publications we saw, and this timeline, which is going to build out over time, is a chronological order of the publishing of the research. So it's not when the attacks happened, it's not when the malware was being researched and the attacks were happening. November 2013, in this case, relates to the date of the publication. So one of the first we saw was Blue Coat Labs publishing on PlugX, malware targeting Mongolia. Specifically with a Mongolian healthcare lure for a new facility that was being built in the capital. And they used the usual kind of components we see with some Chinese adversaries, which is a DLL side-loaded kind of WinRAR or archive package containing the benign file that's going to be used to load the malicious DLL and all the other components as well. The next publication we saw was Bure Networks in April 2016, published about poison ivy malware. That was primarily hitting Myanmar, and the lures there were mostly Asian related, so that association of intergovernmental relations. July 2016 was the first activity we saw and that we published on. So Unit 42 published about a 9002 Trojan that was being seen delivered by Google Drive, or through Google Drive as a sharing mechanism. And it was targeting Myanmar, and specifically we saw some activists, some known activists from that country being targeted. And the lure in this case was relations between Taiwan and China, the cross-strait relations. So this was the first time that we saw the activity, and that's why I say we've kind of actively been tracking it for 3 years, since 2016. But through the work that we've done, hunting for more samples, pivoting on infrastructure, and looking back at finding these previous publications, we've been able to say that the group's active for about 6 years. So in March 2017, we saw some Japanese researchers publish a report, initially in Japanese. It was translated to English. That was based on information from the VKRL, which is a Hong Kong-based cybersecurity company. And they named that campaign the tongue twister FHAPPI, which is free hosting APT power exploit poison ivy. That's what it stands for. And that was, as you can guess, poison ivy malware being delivered to various victims. They saw Chinese targeting with Chinese language in the lure, and also Mongolian victims as well in a second campaign. And essentially the phishing email had a link to Japan GeoCities website where VBS would be executed. Eventually PowerShell would step in and run other code to deploy a payload onto the victim system. In analyzing that PowerShell code that was on the GeoCities website, it turned out to be a version of PowerSploit, which is a post-exploitation framework available on GitHub that's commonly used by pen testers, but in this case was used by the actors as well. In March 2018, we published on HenBox. I'm not going to go into any detail because I cover that in a minute, but that's the Android malware. And then in February 2019, the most recent publication we've done was about this other Windows-based malware we've seen that we called Farseer. Pretty similar to Poison Ivy and PlugX in that it uses DLL sideloading to run. It's a remote shell and all the good stuff you get from Poison Ivy and PlugX, but it is different. And the lure for the Farseer attacks, we saw some decoy documents about Myanmar, and we've seen telemetry from Mongolian hosts, so the targeting is in the same region as well. So as I said, when we found our piece of our discovery in 2016, we start to pivot out and try and find any related infrastructure. We found the previous publications by those two companies. We eventually found an Android file, which we then discovered was HenBox malware, and the cyclic process continues. So one of the tools we use quite often is Multigo, and it allows us to pull in data from lots of sources and have a visualization like this, where you can start to really see how the different parts map together: files, IP addresses, hashes, domain names, all that kind of stuff. Again, what I said earlier about Chinese actors trying to track them, it often ends up with like messy Multigos like this, but for the most part, this group's not so bad. So this is where we're going to focus now, these green dots, which are the HenBox, or the Android icons. For this particular piece of malware, we saw that it was a custom piece of malware we'd never seen before. It includes lots of tools like super user capabilities to get access, elevated access to the device. Contains BusyBox, which is a cut-down version of Linux, like shells and components to give you kind of sysadmin tools on the Android device. Contains some anti-emulation, anti-analysis techniques. And from the original samples we found, we've been able to expand our search, and we've found now over 400 samples that date back as far as 2015, but also we're seeing them even this week. In terms of where I'll talk about the delivery in a minute, but we're seeing plenty of samples. Primarily seems to be targeting the Uyghur population, which is a majority ethnic population in the Xinjiang region in the northwest of China. And as per the map that you just saw, there's lots of infrastructure ties with previous attacks with a focus on politics in that region. Okay, so in terms of where the name came from, if you know anything about Android files and APKs, there must be a package name. There can only be one package name on the device at once with the same name. So you can't have, say, two Facebook apps on the same device. In this particular case, most of the apps we saw were called com.android.henbox. That was the package name. And the digital certificate or developer signature, or whatever you want to call it, the signer, typically look like that second bullet point. We have seen variations of the two. We've even seen some samples that use the Android developer, the Android debug signature, which is a bit of a mess because lots of malware uses that. But predominantly it looks like this. It masquerades as a variety of legit apps, so you see things like those icons like backup and settings being used as the app names, just to try and make it look like it's a benign application. And there's lots of reference to what I now know to be a Chinese consumer electronics manufacturer called Xiaomi. Rather embarrassingly, when I did this research, I'd never heard of this company before, but it turns out they have a lot of stuff, and they're a big company. So Xiaomi, and also references to MIUI, which is their kind of Android version. They have a fork of Android called MIUI. And if you look at the code here, this is during the installation of the app and the execution, where it's trying to determine whether it's on an emulator device and doing other background checks. It also checks for whether it's running on a Xiaomi device or whether it's running on that MIUI firmware. It looks like it's conditional, so if it's on that device, it probably would have continued to infect. But actually, there's quite buggy code there, and it's been there for a while, where it always return true, in which case it runs on emulators, it runs on Samsung devices and all that kind of stuff. So in terms of the delivery, as I mentioned, we've seen like 400 odd samples of this. The vast majority we've managed to get through various means of crawling the internet, gathering samples from VT through the Cyber Threat Alliance and other sharing. But there was one particular app that we saw downloaded in May 2016, which was pretty interesting. So this was someone behind one of our firewalls. I believe it may have actually been in like a university network. But behind one of our firewalls, they downloaded an app from a website called WeGetApps.net. So that gives you some indication of who that app store is trying to serve. And they were trying to download app ID number 40. And at the time, that app was, this is the app store here, at the time that app was Droid VPN. And although the app was called Droid VPN, the package name was HenBox, and we were detecting it as malware. So the Uyghur App Store at the time was a Windows 32 box. It had a very outdated version of Apache, and my gut feeling is the box was compromised, and the actors implanted the HenBox app overriding the Droid VPN app. So if you downloaded Droid VPN, you'd get HenBox malware. In this case and a few other cases, that benign application was actually embedded inside the HenBox app, and during installation, it would try and start the install of that benign app as well. So eventually, you may have actually got the app you were looking for, but on the way, you would have been compromised as well. So the Droid VPN app on that app store looks like this, and it's available on Google Play, so it's a completely legit app, but for a period of time, it was compromised on that app store. So using a heat map, which is quite a traditional method for trying to look at some data and try and understand some patterns, I've got the package names for the apps that we've seen on the left column, and I've got the app names across that top row. It might not be completely visible to you, but you can start to see some trends. So as I mentioned, com.android.henbox was certainly the most prevalent package name, and the most prevalent app name in this case was backup in Chinese. But there are some other, clustering of more popular samples and combinations of app names and package names being used that include things like synchronization service, backup service, and all these things that would basically tell the victim that it's a benign app and not to worry about it. We've seen some other app names which target the Uyghur language and the Uyghur population again. And we've also seen an app that was called Jihadi Nasheeds, which I think are Islamic songs and poems. We've seen apps like Hawa, Nur, Ot-Cax, and a few others which seem to be focused on the Uyghurs and that kind of wider Xinjiang region. And when I grab some text off a legitimate app store for that Ot-Cax app, it translates to, this app is specially designed for domestic minority people to download and install. So it's the perfect kind of target to import or have some malware, make it seem as if it's the same kind of app as that one, and then try and get people infected. So in terms of the app structure, they're pretty convoluted apps. I mean, most of the malware I see on Android are typically an APK file, which is a zip file, basically, containing a DEX file, which is the mandatory code file, and a few config files, and that's about it, really. In this particular case, we see numerous ELF libraries that are there for encryption, decryption, for tracking location. I think they had the Baidu tracking code in there in an ELF library. There's a config file and the zip file over there on the right that contains yet another DEX and an ELF. Those both are loaded dynamically at runtime. And the DEX file is actually, that second DEX file is the bit that does a lot of the espionage tracking work. So it's pretty convoluted. A lot of the components are XOR encoded or RC4 encrypted with some compression. So in many cases, the static kind of signatures and AV detection isn't enough to get inside these. And an optional component on the left-hand side there is that there may be these decoy apps also embedded within the APK. So I talked about Droid VPN, but we've seen the Uyghur language translation app being carried inside another APK for a different campaign. We've seen the AMAC agency app, which is an app reporting on ISIS news. And another one is Islamawazi, which is related to the Turkestan Islamic Party, or TIP, and it was their media player of some sort, again, probably news-related, but we've seen those benign apps, those legitimate apps embedded within various HenBox components. So if you're getting the idea about the tracking I was talking about before and the locations of the targeting, This region, borders many other countries, and it's quite a hotbed of political interest. It's part of the BRI, and there's been lots of kind of news in the last few years, especially, and especially in the last few months, actually, around lots of people being detained there, tracking of these Uyghur population, and various other things related to the BRI. So I won't go into any more detail, but you can kind of see the targeting there. So in terms of the trigger, when you install a piece of malware on your Android device, as you do, you can launch it by pushing the app button and it will run, but you can also have these external triggers. So if the device reboots and the app is hooked, like an intent like this to be known when the device boot completes, it will execute the malware. So it's a bit like a registry run key for Windows. There was an interesting intent in here about Xiaomi again, and again, had no clue really who Xiaomi was until I did this research. When I started, I think they were the 6th largest smartphone company in the world, then the 5th, now they're the 4th, number 1 in China and India. And I think in India, at least, they overtook Samsung as a smartphone provider. They've also got a shed load of IoT devices, so things like IoT rice cookers, washing machines, robotic hoovers. They've got scooters and all this other kind of stuff. And all these devices are internet connected, which is great. And they communicate through various devices and their Mi Home app, if you have that. So if you have a device which needs to send an alert to your phone, it will ping the cloud, it will come down to your phone, and the app will tell you that something has happened, as you know. So in this case, the HenBox malware is relying on those kind of events as well to trigger the malware. In terms of objective, it's all the usual suspects really for a kind of espionage or spyware Android app. So registering SMS handlers for processing incoming SMS messages, monitoring the device, monitoring outgoing phone calls, and at least up until recently, it was only focused on Chinese numbers, +86, tracking location, and reading from various apps. So this sample that was in very early 2018 covered 13 different apps that they were trying to find if they were installed and extract contacts and message details from. In many cases, it's as easy as getting hold of the SQLite database on the device, opening it up, running some database queries, and gathering that data. And about 4 months prior to this version, they only had 2 apps that they were tracking. So it's quite an aggressive development schedule in 4 months to add like another 11 apps. So in terms of the recent campaigns, back to the map again, we found a new piece of infrastructure and related samples, so we're going to dig into that in a minute. So we saw this originally from a tweet, and if you're not on Twitter, it's a pretty good threat intel source at the moment. People are posting hashes and domain names all over the place, so it's good. It's a good feed. In this case, we saw an LNK file, various executables, including the Mongolia one there, and a C2, apple-net.com, with a few pictures there. So definitely like a Vietnam-looking or Vietnamese-looking decoy doc, what seems to be Pakistan, and also Mongolia as well. So when we looked in our data set, we had a couple of samples, PlugX samples related to August 2019, looking at some behavior like the file activity around HTTP DLL and HTTP DAT. We found a few more samples as well, dating back to about June, I think, this year. And we also uncovered a couple of IPs that were being communicated to directly from this malware, rather than the apple-net.com domain. And we certainly saw the Mongolian targeting. So it's already been mentioned several times, at least in the talks that I've seen this week, that Google is your friend, and quite often just simply Googling stuff will give you the answers you need. In this case, there was a GitHub repository where someone had posted a write-up, including tons of IDA screenshots and other stuff, about an unknown Chinese APT. It was called Strange Real Intel. And in this case, they talked about the same kind of files, the same file names. They provide some hashes. I've heard there's something like 36 ESET people here at this conference, which is insane. But digging a bit deeper into this file, we found that one of the files being used to sideload this malware was a benign signed ESET binary. So if you haven't seen this, then here's the hash, and we can talk about it. So that was loading the malware. We've seen possible Pakistan targeting based on the decoy documents there, the special branch sind.exe. And these decoy documents are like 40, 50-page, very heavy policy government documents that are embedded in the malware that are thrown up as a decoy to believe that it's the right thing you're looking at. And the LNK file we've seen looks like the part of the Vietnam targeting. And it's a shortcut file, but in this case has appended HGA and VBS code as well. Back in July, some people from the US, I think the assistant to the president, were there to talk, were in Mongolia actually to talk about economics, trade, and also the security concept stuff. So that definitely ties in with a lot of the that first file and that malware and targeting. So if you've ever looked at LNK files, they're incredible. There's so much data inside them, like MAC addresses of the computer that created the LNK file. There's host names, there's various other things. And in this case, above that red box is the original LNK file, and then you've got this appended HTA hypertext application code with VBS code, and then a very interesting looking 4D5A or MZ header for the payload which is going to be run. If you look at the properties of the file, you can see a very interesting command line argument there that's basically looping around trying to execute that HGA and the VBS, and you've also got the host name there. So you can write Yara signatures and do loads of other retro hunting with this kind of information. For us, we've got a whole bunch of LNK files, and we can do some DB queries on them. But we've seen these two other files coming from the same host name, that host name there, and they were related to the UN Security Council and also some other Myanmar-related targeting. If you look at some of the code in there, there are patterns like starting a WinDIR and these nested for loops. So if we start looking at that and just say, show me all the file names where this activity is happening, we've seen a ton of other LNK files, mostly with Vietnam targeting. So that low confidence Vietnam targeting is starting to come up in our view. And if we actually look at host names using that same command, we can then see, there's three other new Windows host names creating LNKs with that same dodgy command line. And the host names are very similar notations, which looks like a default Windows install. So here we're just trying to unravel this and pivot out more and find more samples, but it's incredibly interesting stuff. So I think I have a couple of minutes left. I just want to quickly go into the Adversary Playbooks and how we try and share a lot of this information with the community. So actually, I think last night the PKPLUG Adversary Playbook went live. So it's a STIX 2.0 package with all the indicators for all those 6 or 7 campaigns that I've talked about. Hundreds of domains and IPs, so go and grab it, and it's on GitHub. And we'll show you the link in a sec. Whenever we try and publish a blog in Unit 42, we try and publish an associated playbook, which is describing an actor. If we already have the playbook, then we just add another play in or another campaign into that playbook. And recently, we published a blog with 11 new playbooks, and then we published one last night. So if you recognize any of the actor names here and you want to go and have a poke around in GitHub, then please do. So this is how it roughly works. We use the attack lifecycle or the cyber kill chain as a framework to describe how this stuff plays out across different phases. We use MITRE attack to describe the TTPs of the actor. And we use STIX 2.0, the JSON version, with lots of other features to wrap the whole thing up. So looking at it another way, you can say you've got one adversary at the top there. Every adversary has one or more campaigns or plays or attack lifecycle instances. There's lots of tactics that they have, and there's lots of indicators. And the way that this maps to adversary playbooks is you've got the playbook at the top, so you have one per actor, multiple plays, one or more play per actor. We're using attack to describe the TTPs, and then all the usual stuff, hashes and IPs and other stuff in there as well, and the whole lot's wrapped up in STIX. So if you consume threat intelligence today, you can go and grab these and just pull them in and take all the data we're giving you. And if you don't, then you can start doing it. So there's the link for the Playbook Viewer. Just because humans aren't very good at parsing JSON and STIX, we created a viewer here so you can go and click around, look at the different actors, look at the campaigns, drill down into the different TTPs as per MITRE, and then look at the indicators as well. So I'm being told that's time, and that is actually, thank you.